And so today we're going to look at kind of the dark side of the fairy tale. And this castle building is one of the more famous ones in the world. You see lots of photographs of it. It is the model for that Disney apparently used for the Sleeping Beauty castle. Technically, it's more of a palace than a castle, but it's kind of a hybrid mix. And it was built by a man known in history as the Swan King, the Fairy Tale King, the Mad King, but mostly he's just the Mad King. And so we're going to look at this man and his castles, why he built them, and the dark side. So let's start with, he's the king of Bavaria. And Bavaria is in the southern part of Germany. Now, one of the things that's hard for us to understand is that Germany, as we know it, whether it's East Germany and West Germany or United Germany, Germany's only existed for about 150 years. Before that, there were these German states. For a long time, it was known as the Holy Roman Empire, which, as one historian said, was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Then it becomes around 1815, they're the Confederation of German States. Now, theoretically, this confederation was to work together, and all of the rulers, some of the rulers were kings, some of them were dukes, they all had different titles. The rulers say, we would like to be unified because we would be stronger. We could be a power in Europe if we were unified. The problem was everyone wanted to be unified with themselves as the boss, and no one was willing to give up power to anyone else. So Bavaria is in the southern section. It's where Munich is, Nuremberg is. It's right next to Austria. And this is, you need to keep this sort of in mind, and you'll see this map again because geography plays a role in all of this. Ludwig himself was born in 1845 in Nymphenburg Palace in Munich. And you can see the picture down below of the palace. Now, these palaces are not just homes, they're government centers, because Ludwig's grandfather, who was ruling when Ludwig was born, was an absolute monarch. He was in control of everything. We think Ludwig was born on August 25th, but may have been the 24th. His grandfather, who was Ludwig I, which is going to make things a little bit confusing, insisted that the baby be named after him, number one, and insisted that they have the same birthday, which was the 25th. And the 25th of August is also the patron saint's day of Saint Louis of France, who was also the patron saint of Bavaria. Bavaria was a Catholic area of Germany. So somewhere in August, Ludwig II is born, named after his grandfather. And Ludwig was the first of two sons that his family had. In the upper left-hand corner, you see the formal family portrait. Ludwig is the little kid standing up with the skirt. His younger brother, Otto, was on his mother's lap. Remember, this is a time when little boys wore dresses, skirts, until they were, quote unquote, breeched, which was anywhere between 5 and 7 years old. You see a picture down at the bottom of the family when they're a little bit older. Ludwig is probably a teenager. I would say maybe 14 years old. His family was not close. He was never close to his parents, and seemingly they had no desire to be close to him or to each other. But he was very close to his grandfather, Ludwig I, and that's Ludwig I, that formal portrait there. And Ludwig was notorious. He was eccentric, he was notorious. He gets into trouble by putting a really high tax on beer, and there were beer riots in Germany. I mean, how dare you? He was a very bad poet. He had scandalous mistresses. He was an autocrat, at a time that there was a movement towards democracy or constitutional monarchy. And in 1848, when young Ludwig, our Ludwig, was just 3 years old, his grandfather is kicked off the throne and his father is put on because his father is willing to be a constitutional monarch. His grandfather was not. And this is really becomes very interesting because Ludwig I is kicked off the throne, and actually he and his grandson spend a lot of time together, whereas Ludwig II spends very little time with his father. As a child, our Ludwig was indulged and controlled. There was a very strict regime of study and exercise. He lived in Hohenschwangau, this sort of fantasy castle. So he had really strict rules and regulations for study and how he was to behave, but the rest of the time he could do whatever he wanted to. So it was kind of like, you know, absolute control, and then everything is, you know, do whatever you please. This is another view of that castle, and this is where he grew up. And this is where he spent a lot of time with his grandfather, this nice sort of fantasy medieval castle. In 1865, when Ludwig was 19, his father dies. His father had been sick for 3 days, so it was very sudden. And Ludwig becomes king of Bavaria. He was not prepared, no way, shape, or form. It was totally unexpected. And frankly, not only was he not prepared, he wasn't really interested. So this is a photograph of him about the age of 19. That carriage is his coronation carriage. Yeah, can you see any inch of that that's not decorated? That becomes typical of this period of time. He was young. He was good looking. That was by their standards. He was very popular with the average person. And he kept on his father's advisors and all the people in government. And he wasn't really that interested in government, so he kind of let them do what they wanted to do. He was interested in art and music and architecture. He disliked public events when he's on display, and he avoided social functions, parties, balls, things like that. He was very introverted, and he liked to spend time daydreaming or drawing. He didn't really want to be, he's 19, he doesn't want to be running the country. He was seen by his people as handsome and generous. He was actually very visible. This is kind of a contradiction in terms. He's very visible to his subjects. There's stories of him traveling around Bavaria, almost incognito, and then giving away money to people who were nice to him. And among the average ordinary person, he was known as Unser Kini, which means cherished king. So government officials might not have liked him or just kind of ignored him, but the average person really thought that they were looking forward to him. This is his coronation portrait. Now, he loved opera. And one of the first things he does is he summons the composer Wagner to his court. And he sponsored Wagner for many years. He even built theaters just for Wagner's operas to be performed. At one point, he actually considered abdicating so he could follow Wagner around Europe. He's kind of the original opera groupie. Wagner discouraged him, but Ludwig supports Wagner, buys him a house, pays for his expenses, and every time Wagner produced a new opera, Ludwig wanted a special performance of it. Now, Wagner, I don't know if you've sat through Wagner or know much about Wagner. Wagner is typical of this romantic Germanic past, and this is the age of Romanticism. That doesn't mean kissy-kissy, but it's a movement in the arts which plays to the emotions, which is looking at nature and the wildness and just the power of the individual. It's not logical, it's just free and wild. And Ludwig is the typical romantic in this sense. As king, now remember, he's 19 years old when he becomes king. He's subject to a number of pressures. And of course, the first pressure is get an heir, get married, have a son. And at about 21, he gets engaged. And he gets engaged to a Bavarian duchess. Her name is Sophie Charlotte. She's a cousin. They were both interested in Wagner. They were both Catholic. But even, it's pretty obvious that Ludwig was not attracted to his fiancée. It was just an arranged marriage. And he keeps putting off the marriage. And luckily for him, maybe, he and Sophie arranged for a series of photographs to be taken of the couple. And she and the photographer began flirting with each other. And they began writing love letters back and forth. And these love letters were discovered. And Ludwig used this as a pretense to end the engagement. So he gets engaged, he breaks the engagement, and I don't know where's the best place to put this in. There are a lot of people who say Ludwig was probably gay. We really don't know because nobody's in the bedroom with him. Asexual, maybe. There's no known mistresses. There's no known lover. But he certainly doesn't get married, and she's obviously a very attractive young lady. Just sort of an sidelight, she goes on and marries a French duke. They have 2 children and a very happy marriage. In 1897, she's 50 years old, and she is in Paris at a charity event. This is an event that was that French aristocratic women put on every year. And every year it was at a different place around Paris. And that year, in 1897, they built this special wooden shed to introduce this new thing of moving pictures. And people would pay to come in to see these moving pictures. This is very, very early. And while they are in there one afternoon, the projectionist equipment catches fire. And the building is raw wood. It goes up very quickly. 126 people die in this fire. Most of them women, and most of them women of the upper classes, wealthy women. And Sophie Charlotte was one. The irony is she could have gotten out, but she chose to help others leave. And she was eventually caught in the fire and did not survive. Okay, back to Ludwig. Everybody with me?
Yes.
Yes.
So Ludwig comes to the throne in 1864. American Civil War is going on, okay? He hasn't been in office just a little more than 2 years when a war breaks out between Austria and Prussia. Those are 2 big Germanic states. That war lasts from June to July 1866. June to July 1866. It's known as the 7 Weeks War. Okay? Would that all of them were 7 weeks if you had to have them. Okay, so going back to the map, Austria is to the south. Prague actually was in Austria at that time. That was the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Prussia and Austria are the 2 largest German-speaking states. And they are vying for power. They're the ones that they're looking at to unify the German states. Austria is Catholic. Prussia is Protestant, Lutheran. The northern German states are Protestant, more Protestant. The southern German states are Catholic. going way back in history, at the time of the Reformation, there was a long war in Germany, and in 1848 the war was ended, and the peace treaty said the war was over religion. The peace treaty said the religion of the ruler is the religion of the people. So the German states tended to be fairly uniform in religion because of that. So the northern states, we have Protestant, the southern states Catholic, and when this war breaks out, Ludwig sides with Austria. Okay. And Austria is defeated by the Prussians. Now, the Prussians are not interested in smushing Austria to the ground. All they want is to show, we are the strongest, we are the most powerful. If we're going to unite the German-speaking states, we're going to do it, not Austria. And so in 1866, in July of 1866, this is what the map of Europe looked like. We've got the French Empire, ruled by Napoleon the second, or third, the Empire of Austria, the Empire of Russia, the Kingdom of Prussia, which has united many of the German states, not all of them, the Netherlands, we don't have England on there, but he is, because Ludwig sided with Austria, in the peace treaty, he is forced to sign a mutual defense treaty with Prussia. And what this means is Prussia says, I will protect you if you're ever attacked. Well, that's a good thing. You know, big country, I'm a little bit safe. But Bavaria has to Prussia if Prussia is ever attacked. Ultimately, he's going to regret that. In 1870, the Prussians managed to manipulate the French into declaring war.
Kathleen?
Yeah.
Kathleen? Somebody's not on mute, and I keep hearing, it sounds like someone's making noise in a kitchen. So could everybody please mute so we stop hearing the bang? Thank you.
There we go. Hi, Lynn. So Prussia manipulates the French into declaring war, and it was a master of manipulation. The Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 1871, and this is kind of misleading. The French army surrenders in 6 weeks. Now, the Austrian army surrendered in 7 weeks, so France doesn't last as long. But the city of Paris lasts for more than 6 months. Paris fights off the Prussians, the Germans. And at the end of this war, France is absolutely humiliated. Bavaria had to help. And at the end of this war, the Prussians have united Germany. The King of Prussia is named Emperor of Germany. And the place of the ceremony, the coronation, was rather interesting. It was in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. Okay, so the German emperor is crowned in France at Versailles. This would be like Vladimir Putin taking an oath of office in the East Room of the White House. You can just imagine how the French reacted to this. On top of that, the Prussians made the French pay for the costs of all the war. They had to give up territory. It was a horrible, horrible, nasty treaty. And this war is responsible for World War I. Okay, so get into a whole thing there. But in terms of Bavaria, the German Empire is created. The states in the lighter yellow, orange, whatever color you want to call that, are semi-autonomous. They're part of this German Empire, but they really have no power. So at this point, Ludwig is still king of Bavaria, but he doesn't have a whole lot of power, and he actually feels quite humiliated by this loss because he's forced to fight this war he doesn't really want to fight. And this failure is going to haunt him for the rest of his life. He feels that he's failed as king. He begins to retreat more and more into himself. He begins to yearn to be a medieval ruler, an omnipotent, a powerful king whose rule couldn't be challenged. He imagines that he's much more than a constitutional monarch who can make mistakes. He's 25 years old. He is young. I mean, I know when we were 25, we didn't think it was young, but most of us are well over 25 now, and we go, we were young at 25. He's really, whatever power he may have had has been taken from him. And at the time of his engagement, he had visited France, and he'd become very impressed with Versailles and the French culture. And he begins to dream the same thing for Bavaria. And he begins to build, and he builds these beautiful buildings, lots of French influences. And many of these buildings are built in areas that were relatively poor, and he was able to provide jobs and incomes for the people who were there. Now, Nymphenburg is the palace in Munich where he was born. Hohenschwangau is where he was raised, but Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, and Herrenchiemsee are castles that he built, and those are the three places we're going to spend time looking at today. But first he starts with renovations. Let's just see how this goes. This is the Residenzpalast Royal in Munich. Nice castle there. He decides to build a winter garden. He decides to build it on the roof. So on the palace roof, he creates an ornamental lake. Okay, think of this as a giant greenhouse with not just a pond, but a lake on the roof of the building. There was a small boat. Obviously, the roof is made out of glass and metal. He had painted panoramas, some of the Himalayas. Okay, there's the boat wandered around the lake. He had swans because he liked swans. He had little funny huts that you could go and sit in. It was made, some of them were made out of bamboo. There was a tent. Here, another view of what this looked like. You know, these exotic paintings, the boat, the lake, the swans. Ultimately, this was closed in 1886, and they demolished it before 1900. They demolished it because the water in the lake was leaking through the roof and seeping into the rooms down below. But in this giant greenhouse type of thing on the roof, he had an artificially illuminated rainbow with electric power. So you could go and you could turn on a button and there would be a rainbow. He also had arranged for artificial moonlight. So you could have a moonlight boat ride around on the roof of your house. I think we all need to do that. Probably the most famous of the buildings he built was Neuschwanstein, and it was begun in 1869. This is just shortly after the Franco-Prussian War, or just before the Franco-Prussian War, and it really was never finished. This is a picture of it being built. You can see it's built up in this incredible rocky, and he used the best modern building techniques. He used steel. He had steam-powered machinery, and he just keeps working to build it and build it and build it. And this is the fairy tale castle. These elements in here that are Romanesque, some are Byzantine, some are Gothic. Walls are painted and ornamented with lots of medieval kinds of symbols, and yet there's a very modern palace underneath. He had an electric bell system, so he could call the servants to at any time. The kitchen had both hot and cold water. There was running water available on every floor of this castle. The toilets had an automatic flushing system. There was hot air central heating. So this is it's an odd juxtaposition. It's a modern for those times, yet with all these sort of pseudo medieval features. This is his bedroom. Looks just like your bedroom, I'm sure. This is what everyone thought, what the Romantics thought a medieval bedroom looked like. It didn't. But it's that romantic, that wild, that imaginative view. You see the wall paintings, the ornamental carvings everywhere, the luxury. Other than the floor, I don't think there's a surface that isn't decorated. This is his dressing room. This is much more Byzantine. You've got the purple, which is associated with royalty. And you can see there that the floor is decorated because it's a parquet floor. One of the things that's really unique in this is the large windows. This was unusual for the time, having pieces of glass that large. Now, he also had to have a grotto. And normally a grotto would be out in the gardens. This grotto is right off the dressing room and his living areas. There's a doorway that you open and you go into what looks like an artificial cave, which is illuminated with lights. So you can have different mood lighting. And as you walk through the grotto, when you get out of it, you enter into a conservatory, a kind of a greenhouse area. You can see the size of those windows, which look out over the countryside. Here's his study. Would that my study look this neat? You can see lots of, ornamentation, lots of images that were used in Wagner's operas, that Germanic past. He also created a special performance hall in this building. He called it the Singers' Hall. It was designed for performances or perhaps balls. There never was a party. There never was a performance here. You can see the detail on the roof, on the walls, on the floors, and the chandeliers. Everything ornate. Now, because he's a king, even though he's a king with no power, he has a throne room. This room was not finished. This is looking towards the platform where the throne was going to be. He never actually finished the throne here. And this is, if you were sitting on the throne, this is what you would look out and see. Again, lots of very Byzantine kind of architecture and ornamentation. The kitchen was incredibly modern for the time. There was a dumbwaiter, which enabled the kitchen crew to send food up to the upper floors. And you didn't have to carry the meals upstairs. And so if you go today, you will see the residence quarters, the servants' rooms, the kitchens, the throne room. And it is, in fact, one of the more visited attractions in Germany. And you can see that it looks like it just comes out of the rock, this sort of natural outgrowing out of the rock at the time. So this is Neuschwanstein, unfinished. It would have been the never-ending project. But while he was working on this, he was also working on Linderhof-Schloss, Schloss, the German word for castle. This is very French Rococo. And if you don't know what Rococo is now, by the time you look at these pictures, you will know what Rococo is. It's also called the home of the Moon King. So this is standing on the grounds looking down to Linderhof. This is the only palace he ever finished. And it's perfect for the person who wants to be alone. So if you want to do a Greta Garbo impersonation, this is where to go. It won't take you very long to see the house. Okay, this is the building. This is pretty much it. On that ground floor level is where you have the kitchens and storage areas, where you see all of those windows, the 4 big windows. That's the living quarters, the living areas. It will take you much longer to see the grounds than to see the house. There are, in fact, 10 rooms. This is the floor plan. 10 rooms, and 4 of these rooms are designed for where servants would stand while waiting for him. The lilac cabinet, the pink cabinet, the yellow cabinet, and the blue cabinet are all waiting rooms for the servants, where the servants would stay until he needed them. The furnishings and the decor and everything in this are Royal French, Rococo. So here is the audience chamber. Okay, now, when kings held audiences, that's when people came and presented you petitions, asked you for favors. It's where you would greet the people. He never held an audience in this room. Never, ever, ever. But this room is designed to impress. If you can find a surface that isn't decorated, please let me know. I can't find it. Here's his bedroom. So you can lay in bed and you can watch your painted ceiling. You've got a balustrade around it, a railing around it, so that, you know, there's a special area for you, and you know, people don't cross over it. This is the dining room, and this dining room has a wishing table. And this is something that the French had invented, but he took it to an extreme in 2 of his 3 palaces. This dining room table, by means of a crank, can be lowered downstairs to the kitchen. So the floor drops, the table goes down, the food is placed on it down in the kitchen area, and then it's cranked back up while you sit there. One of his cooks says, the king wants no one around him at meals. Nevertheless, the dinners and suppers always have to be large enough to serve at least 3 or 4 people. So imagine this table coming up out of the floor, set with food on it for 3 or 4 people, not a servant around you, not a servant in the room. This way, the king always sits down and eats alone, but he doesn't feel alone. He believes himself in the company of Louis XIV and Louis XV and their lady friends. And he even greets them now and then and carries on conversations with them as though he really had them as his guests at table. Well, I'm not really sure he talked to them. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I don't know. But he ate here by himself with the table set as if to feed 2 or 3 other people. This is his own Hall of Mirrors in this building, small room actually. This is where he spent his nights. Ludwig frequently slept all day and was up all night. The candles in the chandelier, there are candelabras on the table, would be lit with, all of those candles would be lit with all the mirrors in the room. You can imagine how bright it was in the middle of the night. This is one of the candelabras in the room. Again, if you don't know what Rococo is, this is Rococo. This, by the way, is made out of ivory. It's one of many of the candelabras are made out of ivory. So this is the building, not a whole lot in it, but we have these 125 acres of gardens, and the gardens were decorated as well. So you can see we've got a pool there with a fountain. We've got a lot of formal gardens. This was the plan that was come up with by a very well-known gardener. We have lots of formal gardens. We also have a lot of vistas, a lot of areas which are just wild. That's kind of that interesting combination of the controlled with the formal garden and the wildness of nature and just letting things grow or making it look like things are just growing. He does make there is a man-made pond because he wants to have a swans, and some formal gardens. And he builds a grotto, but this time on the grounds. And this is called the Venus Grotto. There is an underground lake and a shell-like boat right out of Wagner, which moves on the lake. And he built a generating plant, an electric generating plant in this region. There hadn't been one, just to make sure he could have electricity in this grotto. Now, remember, in his Hall of Mirrors, he's using candles. But here, he's got electricity. The boat moves around by electricity. He also can change the lighting in this grotto. It could be red, it could be green, it could be blue, just depending on his mood. He builds little funny hideaways. There's a little chapel. There's a Moroccan house. There's also a little Moorish house, not much to look at, but inside he decides to put a throne. So this is his peacock throne that he has built inside this Moorish house, which is really just a hut on the grounds, a place for him to retreat to in case it's getting too busy for him in the house with the servants. He called himself the Moon King, and we can see his fascination with the French in this house especially. He saw himself as a shadow of the Sun King, who's Louis XIV. He would go on moonlight sleigh rides in the wintertime. His footmen would be dressed in costumes of 100 to 200 years before, and they would go in the middle of the night, travel around the countryside in the moon. It kind of sounds like a vampire, doesn't he? But if you look at this picture, this portrait he had painted for himself, and compare it to the formal portrait of Louis XIV, you can see the similarities in this. I mean, he's got the same pose, only instead of a staff in his hand, he's got a sword, I am the ruler, I am the king. Everything about this is a kind of he sees himself as a mirror reflection, maybe the moon to Louis's sun. Herrn Chiemsee is his own Versailles. If he's going to be Louis XIV, you might as well have a Versailles. And so he begins this in 1878. And he has his own Hall of Mirrors, except he makes it longer than the real Hall of Mirrors. Got to outdo him just a little bit. Other than that, it's virtually identical. He has a writing room, and this is very kind of Louis XVI style, the white and the gold. With Louis XVI style, if it wasn't gold, it was white. If it wasn't white, it was gold, maybe with a little wood thrown in. And here we have the dining room table, the wishing table. And if you look closely, can you see on the floor where the table would go up and down? I'm not sure I'd feel really comfortable in those chairs. I'd move that chair way back. But you can see on that floor, you would crank the crank down below, lowers the table, they'd fill it with food, and they'd crank it back up. So no servant had to serve him because he wanted to be alone. The first room to be completed was his state bedchamber, again, very French. And one of the things that's really interesting is that there is a staircase here, which is a recreation of the ambassador's staircase at Versailles. Now, that staircase at Versailles has been demolished. It doesn't exist. So if you want to know what the staircase looks like, you have to go to Bavaria. And at this point, okay, he wants to build a second one just like it. But at this point, he's beginning to run out of money. He only spent 10 days total in this building, okay? So all of this building is built for a grand total of his 10 days. His gardens are very much like Versailles, wanting to live that life of the absolute monarch, but he's out of money. And he has plans to build more. He's borrowing money to build this building that he's not spending any time in. And so to build these gardens, which go on for miles and miles and have all these artificial watering systems. One of his plans was for what he called a robber baron style castle in Gothic style and Falkenstein. He also planned a Byzantine style palace and a Chinese summer palace. I mean, doesn't everyone in Bavaria need a Chinese summer palace? So this is what actually got built of Falkenstein. Here's his dream, what he thought it was going to look like. There's where it is. Okay, it's just not building these buildings, but it's where he's building them in some ways. I mean, this is, even today, building something on top of that mountain would be difficult. And this was 150 years ago. So, okay, that's what got built. That's what he dreamed. That's looking from a little bit further away. Let's go down in the valley. Can you see that second peak from the left? That's where he was going to build it. You're going to have to get all those supplies all the way up that mountain. And at this point, his ministers have had it. He spent all of his own money. He's spending government money. He is 14 million marks in debt. It's hard to figure out what that's in today. We're talking millions, if not billions in debt. And he refuses to listen to the government officials who say, enough, you have enough places. You're not even living in the places that you have. No more building. And he says, I'm going to fire you. And they've decided they have to get rid of him, that he is a danger to himself, to the country. And the only way they can get rid of him, they decide, is to declare him mad, to declare him mentally ill. But he doesn't spend a whole lot of time with people. And you can't really say, hey, Your Majesty, we're going to send you a psychiatrist to come and a doctor to come and examine you to see if you're mad. So what they do is they hire a guy who gathers information. Now, he doesn't gather it from Ludwig. He never actually talks to Ludwig. He talks to people who knew Ludwig, like that chef who says, yeah, he used to talk to people at dinner time. Well, I don't know if he actually talked to people at dinner time. Have I ever had conversations with imaginary people? I have to say, yeah, there's times I've in my mind, I've talked to people, maybe out loud, I've talked to people. I know they're imaginary. No one's in the room with Ludwig while he's having this dinner. They're down in the kitchen, they're making things up. And that's what this investigator does. He gathers information, he gathers rumors, and he presents this information to a group of doctors. And here's why he says Ludwig is mad. Ludwig is mad because he's shy. He's imaginative. He has bad table manners. He sends his servants to distant lands around the world to research architectural details. His hobbies are expensive. He's been known to eat outside when the weather is cold outside. And so they gather these rumors, this information, and they give it to a group of doctors who, of course, are primed to find him mad, and they actually declare him insane. None of these doctors have ever met him. And the Bavarian Congress, which is known as the Diet, declares him insane. And in early June 1886, he is deposed. They kick him off the throne. Only he's not gone. He's sitting in Neuschwanstein, and they're in Munich, and they say, you're no longer king. And he goes, I am king. I'm king. I'm the king of the world. And so they send a group of men to put him in custody. And he knows that they're coming. And in fact, the local police held off this delegation of officials at gunpoint. And there was one local woman who attacked them with her umbrella. I visioned of this woman with her umbrella, just whacking them, go away, go away. He had a lot of loyalty of the local people. The average ordinary citizen was loyal to him. It's just the government officials and the hoi polloi who weren't loyal to him. He decides not to stay in the castle, and that was his mistake. And he tries to escape, and he was captured. And he's sent to a castle which is just south of Munich. When he's at that castle, okay, it's like the day after he was arrested and put in custody, a doctor actually talks to him, and the doctor says, this guy, he may have some problems, but there's no reason why he can't stay on the throne. He could actually be treated. And that evening, Ludwig and that doctor go for a walk and never return. On June 12th, 1886, they find the bodies of both men in a lake outside the castle. Ludwig was floating on the lake. His death was ruled a suicide by drowning, but there's no water in his lungs. And he was a strong swimmer, and the water was only waist deep. Okay? So you'd really have to work to commit suicide that way. He had never expressed suicidal thoughts, but, and the body of the doctor had a blow on the head and signs that he had been strangled. So the officials say Ludwig had attacked the doctor, strangled him, hit him over the head, strangled him, threw him in the water, and then he flung himself in the lake and committed suicide. We really don't know. There are reports that he may have been shot. There are reports that he was perhaps trying to escape, that there were people with boats on the lake who were coming to help him get away from that. Other people say, well, maybe he died of natural causes because of the stress of all of this. He's 40 years old. Is it possible he had a heart attack or a stroke? Yeah, it's possible. We do know that the people in charge of the autopsy and the people who made this report are the same people who wanted him off the throne, who wanted his brother on the throne, because they could control the brother and they could control everything. So he left us with this building. He left us with a number of buildings that they cost a whole lot. It's sort of like Downton Abbey. You know, it's an enormous expenditure of money. This is probably one of the most famous places and most visited places in Germany today, certainly bringing in the tourist dollars. But it's a product of a man's imagination, probably a man with too much money, too much time, and not enough to do. So that's sort of the dark side of the fairy tale. Okay, anybody have any questions?
Are any of those houses, were any of them used in The Sound of Music at all?
No.
No, not any of those.
No.
I think I saw a concert at one of those houses. I think it was the that they have every year.
Yes.
I think it was the oh, I can't remember the name of it now.
Trinity or Linderhof?
No, that was it.
I was lucky enough to get to visit Neuschwanstein. It's quite a few years now. It was in 1995. And it was one of those things that I dreamed of all my life. Ever since I had first seen the, first picture of Neuschwanstein. And it was an incredible experience. Just getting up to the castle, walking up, was a aerobic exercise. But I did come home, and my bedroom back in New Jersey resembled that bedchamber. I want you to know that.
Who became king after that? Did they have a king?
His brother became king, and basically the Prussians were becoming, the German emperor were becoming so powerful that these little rulers could walk around with the title of king, but they didn't have any power. So Bavaria starts just becoming melded into the rest of Germany. But there's always been, Adolf Hitler started his power in Bavaria, because Bavaria's always, you know, I know it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us, but that Catholic Protestant, Catholic Lutheran divide it's going away now, but it was very strong even 150 years ago. So 100 years ago. So that's, you know, playing that role there.
Thank you.
1970-71, that was both the German and the Italian reunification era, as they called it. And so you had an awful lot of interplay going on between these small, powerless states. And interestingly enough, it's how my father's side of the family got here, because my grandfather, my great-grandfather, was a court interpreter, but he was on the wrong side. And when his royal patron was absorbed into the New Germany, he had to run for his life. So they made up the last name. I don't really know what our last name was. The name that I grew up with really meant milking the cow. So, you know, I have no idea. But it was a pattern in that whole Germanic area, that alliances were made and broken and made and broken and got absorbed from here and absorbed from there, until we wound up with what became the modern Germany.
Yeah, the brains behind that was a guy by the name of Otto von Bismarck, and, you know, an absolute master manipulator. And the irony is he did this all with Kaiser. The German emperor takes the title of Kaiser, which is Caesar. Kaiser Wilhelm I, and when his son Wilhelm II comes to the throne, Wilhelm II doesn't want to share power with Bismarck, and so Bismarck gets kicked out. But as I said, this whole period of time gets, you know, the fear of Germany for if you can think back to that map, you have France and Russia, and with Germany in between, and both France and Austria to the south. All of those countries are trying to balance power. And as Germany becomes stronger and stronger, there's a real fear of that German power. And you end up with an alliance between the French and the Russians, which says, you know, if Germany attacks us, we're going to fight them. And so there will be a two-front war for Germany. Austria and Germany unite as the German-speaking places. England, for a long time, and kids will never understand this in the future. We will understand it because we did it. You remember in the playground, you had the seesaw or the teeter-totter, depending on what area of the country you lived in. And you didn't always play on it the way you were supposed to. And sometimes a person stood in the middle, and you have people on either side, and that person in the middle would kind of balance them out. And that's the role that England played for many years. England tried not to side with anybody, but if somebody got too strong, they would say, well, maybe we will help you, help them. And it's when you have that, you end up with a system of alliances, which when a 19-year-old in Serbia kills somebody, it's like we set up the dominoes and the dominoes all crash down, and that's World War I. Everybody gets drawn into the war within a very short period of time. Yeah, there's playing for power, and I used to say to my students, I'm going to make one of you king of the classroom for the day. You can be in charge for the day. And they go, oh, wow. And I'd say, well, who should be the person that I pick? And every hand would go up, virtually every hand. Everybody's willing to be the king as long as they're the king. And that everybody's willing to give someone absolute power as long as they have the absolute power. But if it's somebody else, they're not so sure about that. So that's part of all of this.
It seems to me that he would be developing the loyalty of the subjects, because with all this building, he would have hired 90% of every town would be the craftspeople building and building and building, and taking years to do that. So of course, all the people in the areas around all of these homes would be loyal to him, because that would be their income.
And generally he built the castles in areas that were undeveloped, where there weren't towns. And so, yes, the people really had this loyalty, the average ordinary person. And the fact that he's known, and he doesn't have to do it often, it's just that rumor that he rides around in the middle of the night or the late afternoon and hands out money to people. Well, yeah, I like that guy. But people who are in charge of the money, the people who are afraid of, and I think there's some fear in Bavaria of the German emperor coming in and relieving them of power. Because like Lynn's great-grandfather, if you were on the other side, you then have to leave for your life, because you're in a difficult situation. So, you know, everybody's playing this power play game.
How many of the castles still survive, of the ones you showed us?
All of them.
All of them except the one that had the ruins.
Except the one that didn't really get built. That they built the wall, that was it. But yeah, they're all.
Can you visit all of those castles?
You can visit all of those castles.
So was there like a central bank in Prussia that he would draw funds from to build these? And is that who wanted him deposed? Like, was there a central power?
It isn't that the Prussians want him deposed. It is that the Bavarians want, the Bavarian government want him deposed. This is a time when central banks are beginning to come into existence, but he's borrowing money from other countries. He's borrowing money from the French and the English and from their banks as well. He issues bonds, just the way we would issue bonds, the government would issue bonds today, and nobody knows how they're going to be repaid.
So
Was there a personal family fortune?
Yes, and he goes through that.
He went through that, yeah.
He goes through that. Now he's going through government money. It's just, you know.
He seemed like he was very sad, because he was, you know, that when you were talking about him, he had all this beautiful stuff around him, but it was like he was just alone. And you know.
I think he was very sad. And I think if I go back to that idea that he may have been gay, he was a very strong Catholic. He was a very devout Catholic.
Yeah.
That would have been a real struggle for him. You know, he was raised, he had no closeness with his family other than his grandfather. His grandfather is, if you talk about mad, his grandfather's probably mad. His grandfather was known for crazy mistresses, for being an absolute monarch, you know, be a king, Ludwig. By the way, Ludwig is the German for Louis, so that's the connection with Saint Louis. But it's just, you know, he grew up a lonely little boy. Yeah. And probably, you know, one of the things he said is, people said, well, why do you always, he ordered people, he loved plays, he loved the ballet, he loved the opera, but he ordered performances where he was probably the only person in the audience. And he said, if I go to the theater, everybody watches me and nobody watches the stage.
I think it's likely that he was somewhere on the autism spectrum.
He may very well have been.
Yeah.
May very well have been.
Was his family with him at all during those times? His children or any of them?
Never married, never had children. His father, of course, dies before he comes to the throne. He never spent much time with his brother. His mother dies shortly after he comes to the throne. So he really is very isolated.
He was isolated. Yeah.
And had been isolated in how he had been raised. Really raised with servants rather than family.
It sounds like he didn't really want to be king either.
I don't think he did.
Yeah.
And maybe had he not been 19 when his father died, you know, that might have made a difference. Had he been 35, you know, maybe it's different. I mean, how many, you know, you think about kids at 19, do you really want to start having to be serious? And, you know, it's kind of like, shouldn't I have some fun sometimes?
Yeah, not at all. Exactly. And then all of a sudden he's thrown into all this power, and he just wants to spend it on the arts and on culture. And
and he was, what he did for the arts and culture. I mean, even if you said, we have the Wagnerian operas, and I don't know how many of you have sat through them, but we have the Wagnerian operas because of Ludwig. Wagner could not have survived without Ludwig's support. And he did support for other artists. Well, just the craftsmen he brought in to do those palaces.
Right, and those were common people. So he was like reallocating government money to the people who probably needed it most. I mean, it was corrupt a little bit, but also in a way it was like, it was helping the working class.
Absolutely. And it was helping the working class in the poorest areas of the country.
Kind of cool.
Anyway, other thoughts, comments?
Enjoyed it.
It was good. Thank you.
It was interesting.
Yeah.
Going to the
Very interesting.
next week, we're going to the Forbidden City. I know that you probably all know Churchill's comment about Russia with a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. This is even more true of China. China is, and frankly, Downton Abbey's kind of fun. Yeah, nice tourist place. Ludwig's castles, yeah, places to tour. But as we look at the Forbidden City, maybe you'll get some understanding of why China is the way it is. And if we're going to live in this world today successfully, we better have a better understanding of China than we do as a country. So anyway, thank you all.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Yes, yes. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.